All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Student Achievement Committee this lovely afternoon. We have here in person committee members Christine Kushner and Monica Johnson-Hostler and Karen Carter. And we also have board members Dr. Martin and Lindsay Mahaffey attending as well. So we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order at 3:03. And if I could entertain a motion to approve the March 22nd Student Achievement Committee meeting minutes.
Move approval of the minutes as second listed.
I think we had a couple of
Pick your pick.
couple of different ones,
Take
but
your pick.
we'll say that the motion was made by Christine Kushner and seconded by Monica Johnson-Hostler. And all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Okay, the minutes have passed. And we have a lot of information today, so I'm just going to turn it right over to Dr. McFarland, and he'll introduce the topics that we're going to be hearing about today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Scott. I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. So our first presentation is obviously very timely. It is about summer learning, and as we know, the legislation was just signed, I think, around April 9th. And so we're bringing that information to you today. And the purpose really is just to provide kind of an overview of the Wake County Public School System Summer Learning Program, kind of the work and planning that we've been doing up to this point. Some highlights that will be included will be just a general overview of the House bill, some of the general expectations. We'll also provide you with some areas of focus, specifically what will be happening in elementary school, middle school, and high school. We'll talk a little bit about staffing, some accountability measures, in the beginning and the end, and then implementation timeline and next steps. Our presenters today will be Drew Cook, the Assistant Superintendent of Academics, Brian Pittman, our Senior Director of High School Programs, and Sarita Smith, our Senior Director for Elementary Programs. And then our second presentation this afternoon is the annual comprehensive plan for equitable disciplinary practices. We generally do that presentation about this time of year. And highlights there will include just sort of understanding the context, the purpose, and the process involved with the comprehensive plan for equitable disciplinary practices. We'll review our work, our progress. We'll look at some of the evaluation summaries around the 3 guiding principles of the CPED work. And then we'll have an overview of some out-of-school suspension data for this past year. And then we'll highlight the work moving forward. And so Paul Coe, the Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services, will be here. Dr. Paul Walker, who is the Senior Director for Student Due Process and Alternative Education, will be here. And then they will be joined by 2 guests, Kathy Shantos and Dr. Rodney Trice, to also support and answer any questions. And I know you're familiar with them because they're a group and they come together and they always do an excellent job every year. So we're happy to be here with you today. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to our summer learning team and Mr. Drew Cook.
Thank you, Dr. McFarland, and good afternoon, Committee Chair Scott, Superintendent Moore, and board members. We do appreciate the opportunity today to share with you some updates and information on our district's learning plan or summer learning plans for the summer of 2021. In alignment with HB 82, which again, as you know, as Dr. McFarland just referenced, was signed into law just in the past couple of weeks. One quick note as we get started for your reference. Earlier this afternoon, we did post an updated slide deck in order to include a small but important adjustment to one piece of information shared in a single bullet on slide 6, which we will talk in more detail about in just a few minutes, but just wanted to make that note for you. Before we dive into the content of the presentation, we'll first take just a moment to reshare a graphic that I believe we've referenced now several times over the past couple of months when bringing information to you on planning efforts for the upcoming 21-22 school year. The graphic that you see here provides an overview of some of the key areas of focus that are guiding our district and our school planning and preparation work. And while it's not necessarily a comprehensive list of everything that the district and our schools are doing, it does give a pretty accurate snapshot of the key areas of focus and decision-making related to the development of teaching and learning structures for the upcoming 21-22 school year. In addition to planning for the virtual academy, which, as you know well, we've spent quite a bit of time and attention on recently, other areas of ongoing work include family and community engagement work, curriculum and learning supports, policies and procedures. For example, I think there are a couple of different topics related to this list that will be discussed and reviewed in tomorrow's policy committee meeting. Also, technology, professional learning, co-curricular activities and athletics, and also extended learning opportunities, which includes but is not limited to summer learning plans, which we'll talk about today. For each of the areas you see represented here, we've got a team of district and school staff members leading the work of planning, development, and implementation for the 21-22 school year. The Extended Learning Opportunities team is led by Sarita Smith and Brian Pittman, both of whom are here this afternoon to lead us through the presentation and to respond to any questions that you may have. I also will note quickly, as has been the case with the Virtual Academy and other topics, we certainly will continue to bring additional updates to future meetings as needed and as new or additional information becomes available in the weeks and months ahead. So with that bit of context in mind, at this time I'll turn it over to Brian Pittman to take us into the details of the presentation.
Good afternoon. As we begin, it is important to ground this discussion not only in the legislation, but also in the past practices within Wake that contribute to our current summer learning efforts. Our district has long provided summer programming to support students. This has historically been focused on two key programs. First, Read to Achieve camps focused on strengthening reading skills for at-risk students in grades 1 through 3. This work will be built into this summer's plan for students. The reading focus that's been the hallmark of these camps will also be expanded to students at other grade levels. Second, in our high schools, we annually offer credit recovery for courses that students did not pass. The goal of this program is to help students accumulate not only knowledge and skills, but also credits necessary to move them closer to attainment of a diploma. This program will continue and be expanded this summer. And finally, it is important to note that our secondary schools have established a tradition of working with students in transitional years, such as rising 6th and 9th graders, in order to orient them to their new school and establish many of the necessary components, especially relationships, that support students in finding success in their new environment. We will be intentional this summer about building this work into our summer focus. As we transition from highlighting past work within Wake County to looking at the components of the state's legislation, let's start with the purpose of the program. The legislation clearly articulates this purpose: to provide in-person instruction, and that's an important phrase, in-person instruction in specific subjects, as well as offering enrichment activities in an effort to address learning losses and negative impacts of the pandemic. The legislation also brings us to expand our focus to include students K-12 and to expand what we offer in terms of areas of focus in order to meet the stated purpose. I'll provide more details on that in the next slide. But before I do that, just some key components of the legislation to mention, including a requirement for either 150 instructional hours or 30 days of instruction. These are full days of instruction, and as noted in the purpose statement, this is in-person instruction. There is not a virtual option for delivery with the summer learning. Also, House Bill 82 requires that transportation and meal service is provided to our students. And finally, that physical activity is required in grades K through 8, in addition to an enrichment activity that is also provided, and we'll talk about in just a moment. As we begin to define our areas of focus for summer learning, we start by focusing on the students that we will serve. The legislation defines the primary focus of summer learning to be students who are identified as at risk. While the state does not explicitly define who is at risk for us, we have worked with stakeholders to determine appropriate measures to use as a starting point. At the elementary level, data-driven lists have been developed based on data from iStation assessments, the number knowledge test in kindergarten through second grade, as well as student performance on specific standards. At the secondary level, we created similar data-driven lists based on past end-of-grade and end-of-course testing and current course grades. With past testing, for clarity, we are looking at students who have multiple years of non-proficient performance on the tests. And we also have to acknowledge that this is not current data presently, which is why we are also looking heavily at current course grades. Finally, schools are also looking at data related to student supplemental and intensive intervention plans in determining who to invite. Overall, we anticipate about 23,000 students will receive invitations to summer learning. This does not include credit recovery students at the high school level, as most of these students will not be clearly known until a bit later in the semester. To put this number into context, we've historically seen with our elementary camps about 50% of students accept the invitation to participate. Also, it's important to note that we've empowered our schools to add to these lists students who they know based on school level data or observations are at risk of not finding success. Schools will be able to invite these additional students, as well as they'll be able to provide the opportunity to participate to students who are not at risk as seats are available. Now that we've introduced the who, I want to take a moment to provide an overview of the what for summer learning. At each level, the focus of the program is slightly different. What is common across grade levels is a focus on building and strengthening content from the year that is presently concluding in a strategic way that creates a stronger foundation for the next grade level or course. At the elementary level, the summer program will include a focus on prioritizing reading and math standards. In grades 3 through 5, science is added as an area of focus. Also, elementary programs will provide enrichment beyond core areas. This can be art, music, technology, or a component of the school's magnet focus. This is an area where schools can personalize their approach based on student interests and available staff. At the middle school level, our program is entirely new, as we've not done summer learning across the board at middle schools previously. The focus will similarly be on reading or English language arts, as well as math and science. Middle schools will also provide the enrichment option described a moment ago as we talked about the elementary school. In looking at the middle school, this is also a great place to emphasize that our summer program will not only work to strengthen skills and provide a stronger foundation for the next grade level, it will also focus on building strong SEL practices into the summer program. Each summer site will be provided, and this is K-12, a counselor who can support this work and work with students in small groups or individually to continue intentionally building those important non-academic skills that are necessary for success. This will also provide us a great opportunity to really connect with the orientation goals at all grade levels. To put this into context, again, just using middle school as an example, many of our 8th graders will have only spent a little over a semester at the school building at this point. The 6th graders, as well as the 7th and 8th graders, will need to engage in opportunities to orient themselves to their school and build strong relationships to support success. And the summer provides us a great opportunity to do that. At the high school, our efforts include 2 key parts. The first is a credit recovery option that we discussed earlier. For clarity, credit recovery is an opportunity for a student who has failed a course to receive credit, specifically a P or a pass, that provides credit for the course but does not impact the grade point average. The second component of the high school summer learning is a focus on the process of strengthening the learning foundation, similar to elementary and middle. This is an option largely for students who have passed the course, but do not have likely a strong foundation for the next course in the sequence. For example, I finished Math 2 with a D and need to strengthen my skills before going on to Math 3. This process doesn't alter the original grade, but it is rather a proactive attempt to support stronger grades going forward and stronger understanding. This effort at high school focuses on EOC courses, which are English 2, Math 1, Math 3, and Biology. That specific focus on EOC courses in high school is part of the legislation. We have chosen to look not just at the EOC courses, but also the learning progression around those EOC courses, with the goal of strengthening student skills both going into and following those courses. So the options will be focusing on providing support for students going into English 1, 2, and 3, Math 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Biology. It is important to note that while pre-K and extended content standards classes are not part of the legislated mandate for summer learning, we are working to include these students and their needs in our planning process. Specific focus will be on recovery services, content recovery, and IEP goals. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sarita Smith to provide information on recruitment of staff, accountability structures, and some next steps.
Good afternoon. The next few slides will outline our plans to attract and recruit highly effective teachers and staff. Given the enormity of this endeavor, a few months ago, we deployed a survey to Wake County Public School staff, which included teachers, instructional assistants, and counselors. Our goal was to gauge interest in summer employment. 4,375 staff responded to the survey, with only about 43%, 1,479, indicating an interest in summer employment. More than half of the interested respondents indicated a commitment to work for part of the weeks. A little more than 1,000 staff members expressed interest in a 5 to 6 week commitment. We are anticipating a huge need for our teachers and staff for our summer learning program. To incentivize staff, the district is investigating the following strategies: an increased daily rate for certified and non-certified staff. This increased daily rate could look like certified staff receiving a rate of $40 an hour or their daily rate, whichever is higher, and possibly an hourly rate of $20 for non-certified staff. Our team is working to determine and finalize salary plans. In the legislation, it outlines a $1,200 bonus for teachers with national board certification and teachers who previously received a bonus related to reading in grades 3 through 5 and math in grades 4 through 8. Additionally, Wake County Public School System is investigating an additional bonus for teachers who commit to the entire length of the program. We recognize that staff consistency for families and students is very important to the success of the program. Staff is planning to bring a summer learning salary structure to the board for approval in May. In total, we will operate 136 school sites to accommodate the summer learning program. Most middle and high schools will offer the summer learning program to their own students. At the elementary level, we will use a combination of both regional sites and individual sites. Students enrolled in alternative programs and at some comprehensive, innovative high school programs will attend summer learning at their base middle or high school. We are still working with some schools to develop how their programs will work. To foster the success of the summer learning experience, supports and resources for consistent implementation is being provided for schools. Teachers will be provided curriculum resources and lesson plans to support the delivery of high-quality instruction. Schools have received a baseline student roster based on performance data. The rosters serve only as a baseline. The allowance of additional students are at the principal's discretion as data suggests and space permits. Special education staff will provide recovery services during the summer learning program for students with IEPs. As mentioned previously, counselors will be available to support students' social-emotional needs. As far as family resources, parents will receive invitations or notifications of their child being invited to this summer learning experience. Finally, we are working on an external site for families that will allow them to access resources and suggested tips for supporting students at home. Schools will also be provided a letter template to be used to notify families, as well as a presentation explaining the opportunity to parents. This will be made available to schools soon. Per legislation, districts are required to report specific data points to DPI by October the 1st. These data points include the assessment results of the competency-based assessment that will be given at the beginning and at the end of the program for students in grades K through 8. We will also report the number of students being promoted to the next grade level or receiving credit recovery. And finally, we will report the number of students that are being retained. Our next steps are identified on the slide. District staff will meet with school-based summer learning planning coordinators this week to dive into the details of the program. Families will begin receiving invitations the first week of May. For planning and staffing purposes, we are asking families to indicate their intent to participate by Friday, May the 14th. Positions will be posted centrally for schools, and teachers will be given up to 3 work days to prepare for and close out the summer learning experience. We will also be offering professional learning for teachers during these work days. And finally, on top of the academic gains that we are striving to succeed, we want summer learning to be fun. We want students to engage. We want students and teachers both to feel engaged, uplifted, and empowered. We want students to achieve. We want to reach the right measures of success. Success is not just limited to academic growth, but also social-emotional growth. Finally, we want to create. We want to purposefully position students to find success in their next steps. At this time, we will welcome any questions or dialogue.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I did also want to mention that Superintendent Moore is on the call as well. She is in her office because she had a meeting that she was double booked unintentionally, but she's here as well. So a lot of information about this program. This is something new. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so I'll go ahead and open up the floor to questions from board members. Ms. Kushner?
Thank you, Ms. Scott, and thank you for the information that was presented today. There's been a lot of questions about what to do next, and I was also noted that the legislation does require it to be fun and positive. So we have to acknowledge the legislature when they make that right decision and put fun in a bill. But I was wondering about it. The legislation also mentions the $1 billion that's come from ESSER funding. So do we, since we are in the budget season, can you give us a sense of where, if we have budgeted some of our ESSER funding to this initiative, and where the board needs to be sensitive as to where to put our resources?
So I'll see if I can tackle that question. We did talk about it some this morning, and as I indicated, I also was in a meeting this past Friday with academic officers from other districts around the state. And we meet every other week, and this is part of what we do dialogue about is the rates and the costs. And so I do know that David Nieder and his team, they are meeting, and we plan to bring some information back to the board very soon about what our recommendations will be with regard to hourly rates, any bonuses, that sort of thing. And part of the meeting that we discussed on Friday was that right now, we want to be closely aligned as districts, because we also know that, if one district is paying more than another, then folks can sort of, cross lines and that sort of thing. So we want to be real consistent, support each other, but also make sure that we can support our teachers in a way that they deserve, because we know what they're being asked to do after the year that they're coming off of, and that's really important. And we want to also make sure that it is a meaningful experience for our students as well, and that we can see results at the end of those 6 weeks. So we will be coming back with that information.
And I think it is important to acknowledge how difficult this year has been for every teacher in our district, pivoting, being hit with so many changes, some of them from the board level, from the state, from all sorts of levels. So teachers have, I certainly am not surprised at the low response rate of interest for continuing in the summer, because I'm grateful to those 1,000 that would say they would they want to keep going. So I'm grateful to every teacher, and many teachers who have children at home who need that break this summer. I can certainly appreciate that. So I'm just grateful to each teacher that responded and that is looking to continue with the summer learning, and to the students, because I can also understand families that also just need a break from school. So we have to make it different and enticing, and I think doing a bonus to teachers for doing the full program is probably a smart use of funding. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we also think once our personnel know exactly what the parameters are with regard to funding and salary, then we may have some more folks interested as well.
And I saw the legislation also included retired teachers, that they're waiving the 6 months pause. Yes. So do we have a strategy for recruiting some of our retired teachers, as well as maybe, I know a lot of our parents are quite anxious to volunteer, not that they would take the place of an instructor, but we might also want to think of a plan to allow some parents and other adults from the community to come and volunteer, because I know a lot of folks are just hungry for in-person experiences.
Yes.
So if we can manage that, I know that might be a secondary emphasis, but for retired teachers, are we looking to recruit from some of our recently retired teachers as well?
Certainly we can look at that, yes. Yeah, our goal is not to turn anybody away.
A quick follow-up on that, Ms. Scott, if you would. That was actually on my list. I'm sure we all received several emails from our retired teachers. So I certainly appreciate you saying we're not going to leave any stone unturned. And I'm not sure if there's particular outreach we can do, especially for our recently retired teachers. But I'd just like to add that I do think it's worth looking into, given folks need a break. And if we have people making an offering, I'd like to figure out how we can explore to do some outreach.
Well, I will add, I know that the HR and finance team is meeting tomorrow about this, and certainly to explore. Then I have a meeting with some folks on our team Thursday about volunteer initiatives and how we can support that. So we are planning for it.
Yeah, and to be clear, we should pay our retired teachers. They're professionals. Yeah. So.
And we'll go with Dr. Martin and then Ms. Carter.
Yeah, thank you. Continuing on this line of questioning, so I appreciate the efforts about recruitment and the HR. My concern, however, is reality doesn't always follow hope. We had the bonuses for bus drivers, a major recruitment there, and we're still behind. Same thing with substitutes. We got a bump, but we did not get the level that we need. And just from a sheer business perspective, I don't have, based on these kind of numbers, I don't have really high confidence that we're going to be successful. And I know you're not supposed to say that because, in education, everything's positive. But the reality is staring us in the face. And so I guess, my question is, there really is only so much we can do in terms of sweetening the pot because we don't have unlimited resources. The state partially funds things, which is, good. We can have some kind of a supplement, but I think there is a real possibility that we need to be prepared for that's not going to give us enough staff. So are we, in parallel, planning? I suppose right now this plan is, individual school sites. Are we looking at possible, consolidation, partnering? I understand the difficulty of having that in a presentation, but the reality of what we're facing, it strikes me that we need multiple contingencies. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, the team always has a plan A, B, and C. We just don't always bring those initially because we're still working out the numbers. But we have had conversations about what if we don't have enough teachers? What if at particular schools? How can we support? And so, the first step in that is obviously meeting with the schools this week and determining the specific numbers. We'll start to do outreach with teachers once we make the decision on the salary to find out. And once we know specifically what our numbers are, then we will have to determine if this is a workable plan or if we need to go back and make some adjustments. But we aren't just waiting until that time.
Yeah, well, thank you. Again, I understand the difficulty of the planning,
Yes.
obviously, but this does concern me. The second question I have, and I appreciate the legislative language that it should be fun, though we don't know what that means. And there are limits to what we can do. But equally strong, and I think almost stronger in what I see in the legislative language, is all the testing. We knew before COVID, we know after COVID, that all this testing is not terribly supportive to education. I appreciate the presentation focusing on, building the competencies for being able to move forward, and yet everything seems to always fall back to those tests. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe what that fun will be, but more specifically, the whole program as set up by the legislature worries me that it's set up to be very susceptible for teaching to the test.
Right.
So what measures are we going to put in place to really be careful that this doesn't just become a teaching to the test? A lot of the vocabulary when people talk about the learning loss really, falls back on a very content-based perception of education. There's a lot that's been learned in terms of resiliency and self-agency and so on. And if we focused on those kinds of things, I think we'd actually see that there hasn't been just all loss during this time. But the focus on loss and recovery, like I said, worries me about the teaching to the test, worries me that the approach will have a tendency toward the remediation, which we've seen some often in schools eligible for Title I funding, as opposed to a focus on the enrichment that doesn't worry quite so much about the test, but worries more about the learning. So a lot of perspective there, but how do we strike that balance?
Well, I can tell you, I'm going to turn this over to the team in just a moment, but I can tell you that in our dialogue, we also are concerned that, the initial assessment and final assessment is, the standards based, and it's sort of like the standardized testing that we know is not the best indicator of student experience and student learning. So we are working to also make sure that we do some of our own assessments. The team was talking about the social emotional piece is really important. We want it to be a place where students are welcome, it's warm, we want to do outside activities, outdoor learning. We want it to be more like the camp experience. And we have provided some of those in our district before. And so this is not our first summer learning experience. And so we're going to build off of that so that it doesn't feel like traditional school, come in, sit down for 6 hours, and then go home. We want it to feel like a summer experience. And so I'll turn it over to the team if they have anything they want to add additionally.
I've got a quick follow-up to add to that, because this would relate to what Dr. Martin is asking. In terms of the required testing, is it all of the test, like which test are the students required to take at the beginning and end, just to get a time, because there's strict time that when those are administered during the school year, there's a time requirement. They take days to go through all that testing. So I was thinking this is a limited amount of time already.
Again, I'll let the team speak to the specifics,
Yes.
but how we determine who is in the summer learning is sort of the district can determine. We're looking at lots of different data points, but specifically in the summer school, there will be an assessment provided legislatively that we will use initially at the beginning and then the end.
So I can join in here just to add, Dr. Martin, I think your point is well taken and is an important one, because if students are not finding some of those non-tangible reasons to enjoy it, and by the way, one of the best ways to enjoy a learning experience like this is to actually be in an experience where you feel like you're growing and you find success, regardless of the assessment piece that's going on here. And so there's a lot of curriculum writing that's happening right now to support teachers, and we'll do some work to support teachers on the front end of this to be sure that they're aware of these resources that are being created and how they can use them, and really to emphasize the point that you just made, which is this is not about curbing the assessment. This is not about the pre and post that we're going to do. It's really about accelerating and enriching and extending so that our students not only feel like they're successful in the summer program, but that they're set up to feel like they are and can be successful in the grade level in the course that they're about to take. And, a huge piece of that is not necessarily how they answer the question on the assessment. It's also restoring and building on that idea that I'm in a school building and an environment where the adults care about me and believe in me to be successful. And if we achieve that in our summer program, I think that will go a long way with the academic goals that we have for the summer and next year as well. And Sarita may be able to share more about the specifics around the assessment piece.
Yeah, so as far as the assessment piece, the assessment that the kids will be given will not be like days worth of testing. It might occur at the beginning of summer learning. We are learning more information about that assessment piece, and it sounds like we may be able to use some of our end of the year from this current year as our starting point instead of having to administer another assessment to the students at the beginning of summer learning. But just to piggyback on what Brian explained is that we're excited, especially at the elementary level, to have science included. And we have dedicated staff members who are working on the curriculum to ensure that experience is hands-on for students, which will make it fun and engaging, because due to the fact that we moved to virtual learning, a lot of students miss out on some of those hands-on experiences. And we're also implementing or embedding in our curriculum some culminating activities where students will be able to highlight their learning throughout summer learning. So it would definitely be more than just the assessment piece. So we have embedded in the curriculum ways to make it engaging and fun for students.
And I certainly appreciate all of that and believe very much in the ability of our teachers in COVID, outside of COVID, to provide our students with meaningful and engaging lesson plans. There was a rather bold principal who I met in District 1 shortly after being sworn in on my first term, who said, look, I know exactly how to get these test scores to come up, because this was a school that did not have a very high school letter grade. And this person said, look, I could do that, just like that, and get these test scores to look better. But what I focus on with my students is authentic learning, and I know that's taking place every day. So I think I trust what everyone is saying, but I do share that concern, though the state has not been forthcoming about how this testing and the information will be used. I mean, it's my understanding that will be used to determine how successful it was, but I certainly hope that's not something that they could hold against either any school district in the state, individual teachers, et cetera.
We will definitely keep you updated, and as you know, with any information coming down from the state and the Department of Public Instruction, this is all new to them as well, and so we're getting updates constantly. I think last week we probably, out of the 5 days, 4 days we received new updates, and so the information is coming fast and furious.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Ms. Carter?
Thank you. Some feedback I've been hearing from educators is just when they'll know more. I know you mentioned that jobs will be posted, but especially like the elementary schools, not every school is going to have it. There'll be regional sites. So is there a timeline for when, like, more specifics, like what schools will have it, the hours, the specific weeks? Because from, like I said, some educators I spoke with, that was their hesitation on being able to say yes or no because they didn't have enough information. So.
Well, I can tell you that the team has been working with schools and principals. We had a meeting last week with principals, and then there was a follow-up again on Friday with the principals. And I know that Sarita and the team are meeting with the summer leaders next Thursday, I believe. So we are working to get that information. Are there any other specific dates you want to provide, team?
So, I think, Ms. Carter, thank you for the question. In general, I think that once we're able to meet with the school-based coordinators later this week and probably finalize some of those details around compensation, that is when, in those first few weeks of May, I would anticipate those jobs would start to post, and staff could apply or contact that principal of the host site if they chose.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I have one more, if that's all right. I noticed the high school recovery, it mentioned that those weren't covered in the 23,000 students. And I guess just for clarification, because I've heard from high school families with concerns around this, will they be contacted under this program, or will that be a separate process? I know that typically high school recovery is offered in the summer, so I didn't know if this was all being rolled in or how that would be handled.
Certainly, yeah. I'll let Brian speak to the specifics, but obviously the grading is the issue. We have to know what the grade is before the invitation, and so once we know that, we can reach out. Brian?
Ms. Carter, I think the answer is that it likely depends whether they will have the reach out at the same time or not. And I know that's always the least comforting answer, is it depends. But really, there are courses from fall that may be open for credit recovery. There may be courses that students are really working hard to pull out now in the spring, that the invitation will come much later when they know what the final outcome is. So I think that it may come at different times for different students. We do know that credit recovery, even though we'll set a deadline for enrollment, we do know that credit recovery will likely have to have students sign up after that point. And what we've communicated to high schools at this point is, while typically they have a bit of a cap on how many students they can accommodate each summer because of the number of seats that they have, what we've communicated to them is, with credit recovery, if they have students who are in need of that and are able to come in, that we will do our best to work with them to be sure that they have the number of seats that they need in order to address the needs of those students.
Okay, thank you. That does help. Thanks.
Ms. Johnson-Hausler, did you have any? Okay. Thank you for the questions. And just one last clarification. Could you remind me again how many teachers it looks like we'll need for this? I know we're receiving initial feedback, and of course, as Ms. Carter pointed out in her excellent question, people could be waiting for that additional information before committing. But as it stands right now, what was the number of about how many additional teachers we think we'll probably need?
Well, I think if I remember that it was 1,300 that were willing, and certainly we're not sure that that would be, depending on how many actually decide to do it. And we may have others who determine once they know salaries and, the specific dates and that sort of thing, there may be more. So I believe the number was 1,300 that it at least had indicated a willingness to do that.
And how many open positions would that leave approximately?
Team, do you guys know? Again, it depends on the final number of students, and so right now the guesstimate is 23,000 students.
So, Ms. Scott, I think the answer to your question is, at least initially, we think that it'll be about 1,100 staff or so that we would need to pull off the program. The unknown variable in that, and so really that number is sort of positive in hopes that we would get those teachers that we need. I think the unknown in that is that as our schools do a great job of recruiting students and engaging families, the number of students who actually attend is going to go up, and then we'll need to identify new slots for new staff to meet the needs of students. So that is going to be sort of a moving target as we go through, and as schools get students to confirm that they're going to attend. The other unknown of that is that we could easily have, a number of teachers more that we need, as opposed to that we have more teachers than we need for positions. But also teachers are going to have preferences about wanting to work near their home, at their base school, that type of thing, or what their content area is. So this is something we will continue to work with schools on as they identify their needs and begin to fill positions. And so the conversation earlier, to really engage in that recruitment effort of others that we need in order to fill those spots. So it'll be a moving target, but one I think that we can make.
And I'll just close with that also. We've talked about how we can support teachers that maybe want to do a 3-week stint, or a 2-week, or how we can, pair folks together. So there are lots of alternatives for us to look at.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Mr. Pittman. So if we need 1,100 staff, if there's 20 children per staff member, that's 2,200 kids. So are we looking at class sizes of 20? Are we looking at class sizes of larger than that? Because I think particularly if we're talking about hands-on activities, the fun activities, then the staff to student ratio is going to be important. So do we have an idea of what we're looking at there?
We are. I think elementary has looked at, and Sarita can correct me, about a staff member to every 18 students is what we're hoping for, somewhere in that range. Secondary will likely be a little bit higher than that potentially, but not by much is the goal. And just as we think through the teaching part of this, I think that one of the things to remember is, students will probably be unlikely to be with the same teacher throughout the day. And so you could have teachers working with multiple groups of students throughout the day. And one of the things that we've shared with schools is just, we're going to have to continue to work with them as they confirm student enrollment to adjust the staffing allotment that we apply to that site, because we want to be sure we're responsive to great school efforts to get students engaged and to engage families on this front.
Thank you.
And Dr. McFarland actually had 2 more questions. Multi-track year-round schools, would this work within their break?
You're going to ask the hard question.
I know, sorry.
No,
Well, not
it-
sorry, but.
we are still working on the summer plan for the year-round schools, but it is not possible to be complete with the plan, in the summer learning by October 1st. And so we're working on what that looks like, if we have to go into the, second track out or maybe even third. So we are working on that.
And are the initial conversations with DPI, do they anticipate that will be flexible for schools, that the
Yes.
legislation will be?
Yeah, Superintendent Moore has reached out to the state superintendent, and I know that Sarita and her team have talked with DPI, and they understand the position that we are coming from, and they are willing to work with us.
And IEP implementation and special education, just thinking about, especially when we look at cost or funding for this, there are students who might have one-on-one aid. How does this apply to any of, especially when we're looking at a child whose IEP calls for services on a regular basis? How would those be implemented in this program? And would that funding also come from ESSER?
So is Karen Hamilton on?
Yeah, I sure am. Thank you, Ms. Scott, for that question. So there are really two summer experiences that we're talking about with students who have IEPs. One would be students who are served on general content and meet the criteria for high-need students, or in elementary school if those students have IEPs in reading or math. So the first thing we want them to do is have that summer experience that we've been talking about so much during today's conversation. So they'll be engaging in the activities that their like-age peers will be continuing in. There is a section of the day set aside where we will address IEP goals and hopefully address some recovery services during that time, although we recognize that we won't be able to address all the recovery needs for all students that are coming to the summer learning program. The second summer experience involves students who are served in extended content regional programs, and those are not covered under House Bill 82 and do not meet the same at-risk requirements. So our summer program that will occur during the same time frame as traditional calendar summer programming will focus on extended school year goals and on recovery goals. And those programs will run full day. For the staffing that are provided in that, we've done a similar analysis of staffing that we have available. And in fact, we run ESY every year. So we're relying on many of the staff that have already worked with us in previous summers. If that requires the inclusion of an instructional assistant to accomplish that, then we certainly have planned for and will be funding for that. Does that answer your question, or do you have an extension for that?
No, that is perfect. Thank you, Ms. Hamilton.
Great, thank you.
Are there any more questions from the board on this topic?
I think we're good, and I appreciate the information. This is a brand-new program, so of course we're still, different pieces are still being explained to us, and I do hope that the takeaway from this presentation can be that commitment that we have to not only address learning loss, but to provide that summer experience and to provide the SEL needs that our students, to meet those needs of our students. And the district's commitment to that is stronger than ever. So thank you for that.
Understood, Ms. Scott. Thank you. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over then to Paul Coe, our Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services, to begin our next presentation, which is the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Disciplinary Practices.
Thank you, Dr. McFarland. Good afternoon, Committee Chair Scott, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Today, we're here to present about the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Discipline Practices. We call it CPED for short. I'm here today to present with Dr. Paul Walker, Senior Director of Student Due Process and Alternative Education. And as Dr. McFarland mentioned, we have our colleagues Kathy Shantos and Dr. Rodney Trice present as well to answer any questions. Before we get to our desired outcomes, we wanted to set some context about our presentation. Within a pandemic, the 2020-2021 school year presented many challenges, and further emphasize the need to look at the foundational needs of our students. At the start of the pandemic, there was an emphasis on ensuring our students and families had basic needs met, from food, devices, access to remote learning resources. And as we pivoted into the 2020-2021 school year, we worked through opening and remote and moved into Plan A, along with Virtual Academy, and the pandemic emphasized the need for behavioral health, centering social emotional learning, mental health, and behavioral supports as key aspects to ensure learning continued for our students. To support our staff, we also provided professional learning that focused on adult SEL, as well as the content-related learning that was necessary to support the heavy lift of our teachers with concurrent teaching. And from a public health standpoint, as vaccines for COVID-19 became available, we worked to ensure our staff had the opportunity to receive their vaccine doses. I say all this in context to note that the work we've done during the school year, there's a direct connection to our work that we've done with the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Disciplinary Practices to help close gaps that we've both seen through the pandemic, but also what we see in our suspension data. And from this context, moving into our desired outcomes, we'd like you to leave the session with the following outcomes. First is an overview of out-of-school suspension data for the 2019-2020 school year, which was certified by the Department of Public Instruction's Consolidated Report. And as a reminder, this is lagging data, and as the 2020-2021 school year continues, we will report out about the current school year at a later time. The next desired outcome is that we want you to understand the context, purpose, and process for the CPED. And the next desired outcome is that we will review our work in progress for the 3 guiding principles within the CPED. And then lastly, we want to highlight our work moving forward as it relates to the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Disciplinary Practices. And in prior years, we've presented suspension data and the CPED separately. However, in this year's presentation, we're presenting both the out-of-school suspension data and the CPED as one presentation to frame the connection between our out-of-school suspension data as the context of where we are at as a school district, and the CPED work as a way to show our progress in addressing the growth areas we see in our data. And as you know, we've provided a note catcher based on visible thinking routine, and this is a resource to help you think about the connections, concepts, challenges, and changes during our presentation that come to mind. And we have much content to get through, and we have a lot of time for your questions and dialogue at the end of the presentation. So if you could hold your questions until the end, we would greatly appreciate it. So I'll now pass it over to Dr. Walker, who will review the 2019-2020 suspension data.
Great, thank you, Mr. Coe. And huge emphasis is really on how NCDPI clarified to all North Carolina school superintendents around January 29th of this year. And it states that due to the COVID-19 health crisis that escalated in March of 2020 and led to school closings across the state, these data sets cannot be accurately compared to previous years. So what data sets are we referring to? It's what Mr. Coe mentioned previously as well. It's the consolidated report of suspensions that DPI produces every year. So after the March 2020 school closures, there were definitely significant reductions in the number of incidents of out-of-school suspensions as we compare it to previous years. So even though the suspension reductions that we are going to share are factual, we must use caution when using the data to make conclusions about exclusionary practices. And so let's go ahead and start with something that, when talking about out-of-school suspensions, we can be proud of. So Wake County Public School System has really championed the lowest suspension rate of the 5 largest districts, and this has been for a solid 5 years that we've done this. So what is this data that you're looking at? So this data is from the consolidated report, and it's produced around February, March of 2021. And so this data further illustrates that school administrators, I think, really tries to use out-of-school suspensions as a last resort. So with that, let's go ahead and look at the snapshot of our data. And so we're in the process of redacting our comprehensive suspension report, and we will provide you with that total information once that redaction process is completed. But here is what you have is that you've been provided with the one-pager, and a link to this document is available as well. So the main points to take away from this data is that first thing you see at the top, district-wide. So 97% of students were not suspended. And Wake County, as we've said, continues to have the lowest suspension rate as compared to the largest North Carolina districts. So let's look at some of the raw counts kind of on the side there. So the raw count in top blue circle, it reads 6,821. So that's the actual suspensions of incidents that we've had. And this includes, there were 3 long-term suspensions, so that number includes that. And we also, for this school year, had 1 expulsion. As you see, that second blue bullet talks about that we have a 31% decrease in suspensions from the previous year. And one of the things that I know that you want to do perhaps is compare like March 2019 to March 2020. And yes, those counts were comparable, though we'll never quite know for sure how the year would have actually ended if there would have been a full reduction, again, if we had a normal year. What's very key is that third blue bullet that I want to highlight is the 4,590. So the way I'd want you to read this is that 4,590 students accounted for 6,821 suspensions. Very important. So this means, of course, that some students had multiple suspensions. And let's go back to what Mr. Coe and we'll talk about more of, but it's the specific focus on our Black and African American students. So 58% of all of our out-of-school suspension were African American students. And we see that the disparity in data is based on African American students accounting for 22% of the population. So let's look at the raw number. The raw number is that we're talking about an actual 3,957 suspensions in this group. And we also see the number 2,517 Black or African American students were suspended. So remember the statement, 2,517 Black or African American students made up 3,957 suspensions. The other group that we often look at that's a concern are our students with disabilities. So we see our students with disabilities, and I'm specifically talking about students with individual education programs, IEPs. And so we see that that's 40.9% of all suspensions total for students with disabilities. And then we have, again, the actual raw counts, 2,789 suspensions of students with disability. The actual students was 1,544. And just some added knowledge is that's about 7.7% of all enrolled students with disabilities were suspended to round out the particular data. So that is my part, and I'll stop there and pass it over back to Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And as you see with the data, we still have much work to do. And within the CPED, we wanted to share with you the context of how the CPED came to be, and we'll review both the process and the purpose as well in coming slides. But first off, we wanted to remind you of, in January 2014, there was a Dear Colleague letter on non-discriminatory administration of student discipline from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Division. that noted that encouraging school districts to administer student discipline without discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And from the tenets of this letter, Wake County Public Schools adopted an initial version of the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Disciplinary Practices in 2014. And also each of you, most of you on this board, WCPS's Board of Education, also revised the Code of Student Conduct to incorporate guiding principles in alignment with the Office of Civil Rights and Department of Justice's Civil Division's guidance with Dr. Walker and his team. And for some additional context, through an agreement with the Office of Civil Rights, we came to a 3-year agreement for the 2017-18 through the 2019-2020 school year. And the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Disciplinary Practices is the tracking tool that is used to record, monitor, and report out our work and our progress. And so the CPED was created in 2014 as a response to the guidance that was provided in this Dear Colleague letter. And just to note, the 2019-2020 school year is our final year of reporting under the current agreement. And overall, the purpose of the CPED is to monitor work in progress through the guiding principles that you see here. As we've mentioned, the first guiding principle is about climate and prevention. The second guiding principle is about clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences. And the third guiding principle is equity and continuous improvement. And with this, we're reporting the action steps and activities that our district is using to promote fair and equitable discipline practices, and also to assess the current state of our action steps and activities. And in our process to complete our updates to the CPED, we had a multidisciplinary team that collaboratively oversaw and updated the CPED implementation. This team consisted of members from the superintendent's leadership team, along with academics, our area superintendents, Office of Equity Affairs, school security, special education services, and student support services. And also, Kathy Shantos has been one of the, she is the coordinator of this process, and she coordinates this work with myself along with these teams and ensured that we met deadlines, and our work also met the reporting expectations of the Office of Civil Rights. And from this process in the next few slides, I wanted to highlight some of our work in progress. And under the first guiding principle, climate and prevention, you'll see the circle, the multicolored circles here that show you the areas of our work under climate and prevention. And so first, under multi-tiered systems of support, we had our MTSS coaches provide support to schools and teachers with core instruction and support related to behavior. Also, our intervention services team provides support to schools related to supplemental and intensive behavior needs. And we've also upgraded our tiered behavior resource guide to outline the best practices in setting up school-wide systems and structures, also setting up the best practices for supplemental intensive support systems, and also the core classroom best practices. And also within the multi-tiered systems of support is behavioral health, where a standard treatment protocol for behavioral health is being developed. We've used CARES funds for community liaison positions and supportive counseling for mental health agencies to ensure to support our students with behavioral health needs. And we have ongoing professional learning for adult SEL, behavioral health, restorative practices, and community resiliency model trainings. And as you remember from our finance committee last week, there's also the SEL expansion case for more positions to support the needs, the behavioral health needs of our students. And in another area, our senior administrators to area superintendents and our area superintendents work with schools to implement core supplemental intensive support systems in their daily work with schools. And then under mentoring programs, we are continuing to explore funding to expand mentoring programs such as Helping Hands. And under our community-based partnerships, we have partnerships with organizations like CIS Wake, Graduate, our Juvenile Crime Prevention Council, also known as JCPC. We have our partnership with Alliance Health and Campbell Law to make sure that we're setting up the best environment for our students in schools. Also with school security in the current school year, there was an internal multidisciplinary task force to review findings from a comprehensive security assessment, and there's a strategic plan to follow. And under policy, like I mentioned before, each of you as board members with Dr. Walker's collaboration made upgrades to policy 4309, where 11 level 1 rules of conduct no longer are subject to out-of-school suspensions, along with an emphasis on using inclusionary practices whenever possible. And the last area I'll mention is around professional learning. Our student support services and Office of Equity Affairs work together to ensure that our staff have equity-based courses available to them. And these courses are, some examples of these courses are Beyond Diversity, which is a professional learning session that is it's a 2-day seminar designed to help teachers, students, parents, and administrators understand the impact of race on student learning and investigate the role that it plays in institutionalizing academic achievement disparities. Another session is Racial Equity Institute, a workshop that helps participants become clear on how race and racism have been constructed in the U.S. and how ideas about racism live in our unconscious minds and social structures even 50 years after the civil rights movement. And there's also our WCPSS equity micro courses. And in these micro courses, we have courses such as supporting LGBTQ students and families. We also have equity leadership, where participants are taken through digging deeper and creating engaging and equitable classrooms. Under Guiding Principle 2, for clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences, there's 4 areas I wanted to highlight. And the first is, again, policy. Like I mentioned in the Guiding Principle 1 work, the Code of Student Conduct, the focus on implementing non-exclusionary practices was a key action step that we've taken as a district. And then we also ensured that schools confirmed through a survey that they've instructed teachers and related staff on how to make a compliant referral for discipline to the administrator, and also make sure that teachers have knowledge of all the rules of conduct and policy through a delegatory model, and principals and assistant principals provided a clear overview of this process during the summer of 2019. And also there's continual professional learning through the Office of Student Due Process for school systems leaders to clarify just the Code of Student Conduct policies that we have implemented. Under school improvement plans, we ensure that teaching, behavior support, and social emotional learning are part of school improvement plans under indicators A107 and A406. And with alternative learning centers, we've formed alternative learning center professional learning teams where teacher capacity is built, and those began in January of 2021 for all middle school and high school ALC teachers on a monthly basis. And also, we prepared to study gaps in alternative education seats to increase needed types and numbers of seats that we have in our alternative education models. And the last thing that I'll mention is around data review. In the spring of 2020 and during this current school year, area superintendents collaborated with schools to collect student engagement data during remote learning and to problem solve strategies to increase engagement. And the last guiding principle I'll review is Guiding Principle 3, Equity and Continuous Improvement. First, under our Office of Equity Affairs, they've established a community equity leadership team that focuses on problem-solving school and district-based equity challenges, and this team meets on the first Wednesday of each month. Our Office of Equity Affairs team also provides leadership support at the school and district level. And during the 2020-21 school year, the district's equity plan was embedded in the latest strategic plan, and we hope that we know that OEA will continue to embed the district's next equity plan in the new strategic plan as well. Under MTSS coaches, during the 2019-2020 school year, our MTSS coaches provided support to schools and teachers around core instruction and support related to behavioral needs. And also under there, our intervention services team also provides support to schools related to Tier 2 and Tier 3 behavior needs. Like I mentioned before, a standard treatment protocol for behavior is being finalized to support and guide this work. And under student support services, we have McKinney-Vento training provided annually for school liaisons. with ongoing follow-up, training and monthly meetings, and school staff are provided training at the school location as requested. Under restorative practices, during the 2020 school year, we had 47 restorative practices schools, and we project to have around 723 circle keepers trained by June. Actually, we had 723 circle keepers trained by June 30th of 2020. And for the community resiliency model, we had 18 schools and 408 staff trained, and we added 27 trainers. And also, in the due process office, we added a data analyst position to ensure that all related discipline data is accurate, complete, and fully accessible to all needed stakeholders so that data-driven decisions about student conduct can be made. And then under special education services, our special education services works with area superintendents, student support services, and academics to ensure core instruction, supplemental, intensive supports are provided for our students with IEPs. In addition, this special education services team provided CPI training, focusing on verbal de-escalation. They also review suspension reports and ensure our autism support teachers and behavior support teachers work within schools to ensure our students with IEPs are supported with their specific needs. And we wanted to close today's presentation about the CPED with a frame of how we're thinking about our work moving forward, and some of the focus areas for us to consider as a district. So with the frame of our Office of Equity Affairs to see, understand, and interrupt results in our district that are disproportionate, well, one of the focus areas we wanted to think about was supporting the development of our content, teacher, and student engagement within the instructional core to ensure that our baseline of teaching and learning is one that ensures student success. We also wanted to make sure that our professional learning sessions continue to focus on creating a safe and supportive environment, such as our adult SEL sessions, our restorative practices sessions, community resiliency model sessions, and the work from our Office of Equity Affairs. Another focus area is to continue to assess our progress through our 3 guiding principles as a district through a review of our action steps, initiatives, and data to ensure we continue our work to reduce disproportionality. And the final is to review board policies and adjust as necessary to inspire and encourage equitable practices. And looking into the 1,000 series and the 6,000 series are possible places to start. So with that, thank you for taking the time to hear our presentation. And now we'll pause here for any dialogue or questions.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Cohen, Dr. Walker. I appreciate the information. And the update. So I will open up the floor to questions from my colleagues. Dr. Martin?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I have a request and a comment. I appreciate this information, and I think a lot of things are going in the right direction, which is good. We still have a lot of work to do. What I think my request is, when we think about equitable discipline, would be, particularly in the future, to expand the information that is reported, because we sort of get the report based on suspensions. I think we all know that suspensions are not terribly effective at giving rise to change of behavior, and I think that's partly why we see repeat suspensions. But if we're going to understand equitable disciplinary practice, it feels to me like we still need something I've been asking for quite a number of years on this board, and that is an assessment of our alternative learning centers. How effective are they? How many students who have gone through any kind of programming in our alternative learning centers go back a second time, a third time, end up toward a suspension? I really think that we need to take a serious look at our alternative learning centers, because our goal of all of this should be a change of behavior so that we don't get the the repeat situations. So I'd love if we could soon get that deeper, effectiveness assessment of our ALCs. And then maybe on the more, extreme side that I think we need to also be paying attention to if we're looking about this equitable discipline is, again, not just our suspensions, but our number of SRO referrals, the number of referrals to juvenile court, and so on and so forth. I am particularly interested in comparing this year under COVID to prior years in terms of the number of juveniles in court. If we're serious about looking at what role do schools play in this, if we only look at school-based data, we only are looking at part of the picture. But did the number of young people in court go up, stay the same, go down? I think that would really help us get a bigger picture. So, this is the same kind of thing I do in my research is, are we looking at just a tiny piece of the picture or are we looking at the bigger picture? And so my request is that we move to a little bit bigger picture evaluation, going to the extreme of the court referrals, to the completely internal alternative learning centers. So that's my request. My comment, you all know that I play with numbers a lot, and I was struck by these 6,821 total suspensions, and that's I'm glad that we're lower than the other major districts per population. But if we figure, 180 days divided by 5, I know we don't have exactly a 180-day calendar, but that's a close approximation. That's 36 weeks. So if we take those 6,821, divide it by 36 weeks, that's 189 cases weekly. If we divide that by a population of 160,000, which is approximately our student population, that is 118 cases per 100,000 population. We're used to looking at those numbers in terms of public health issues. CDC told us that for COVID infections, 100 cases per 100,000 population is high transmission. So here we are, our suspension data is 118 cases per 100,000 population. Our suspension data suggests that we're still at the rate of high transmission if we think about our discipline and suspensions in a public health context. I think that we would do well to start thinking about our equitable discipline system in a public health context, because I think it actually does spread, not unlike a virus does. Right? When I've got one disciplinary situation, it often catalyzes another and another and another. So, just looking at these numbers, particularly in our current setting, I think it's a little bit sobering, but I think that it would do us well to look at our discipline in a public health context and acknowledge that we're still under a level of high transmission. Thank you.
Dr. Martin, thank you for that. I absolutely appreciate you highlighting that this is still much higher than we would ever want to see, and it is certainly not to suggest that we're trying to sweep things away. We want to address this because we care about the whole child. We're invested in serving the whole child, so this is part of that, and I do appreciate that. And I would like to know, I would imagine the board could be provided with that data, Dr. Welker or Ms. Shantos. I'm not sure if either of you were on, but the number of court referrals that did take place during that same time frame for juveniles. comparing that.
Jump in really quick, and I believe we could get that data in collaboration with Russ Smith's team and figure out how to get that data to you. We'll just have to dig into it and bring it back at a later time.
Okay, thank you. I really do feel that that would be helpful, eye-opening, if there's a difference in that. In addition to Dr. Martin requesting that we also look at the number of SRO referrals, I know we have to be careful about not unintentionally identifying students. We need to be careful with how data is reported, but also students with disabilities. There are a large number of students with 504 plans or individual health plans or other ways that their disabilities could impact their day-to-day time in school. And is there a disproportionate number, or not disproportionate, but do we see an additional rate for those students? So I know board members have requested that, and I can understand that that's tricky to report, but it certainly is useful information. Ms. Mahaffey, did I see your hand? I did not see your hand. Oh, I did not. I certainly understand it's a lot of information to take in. Ms. Kushner?
I'll go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Scott. And along the lines of what Dr. Martin was pointing out, with the students who have multiple suspensions, I'm wondering why we're not, a couple of years ago, we talked a lot about elementary schools level suspensions and truly focusing on the hundreds of kids that were getting multiple suspensions at this elementary level, and we saw that reduced. I'm wondering why we're not doing that more intentionally as part of MTSS to really focus on the students that are getting more than one suspension, because clearly there's a lot more going on there that a suspension, as Dr. Martin alluded to, is not solving the problem other than interrupting the behavior that's going on at school.
So, Ms. Kushner, I can jump in. And so up until we closed schools due to the pandemic, the elementary and middle school cohorts were they were continuing, but since that time, we have not restarted the elementary and middle school cohorts with working with our Office of Equity Affairs. So I think that's something that we could look at to revisit and continue and figure out like how we can start as early as possible. But one thing I might mention, Ms. Kushner, to your point, is that how we started restorative practices started in the elementary realm because of a high rate of suspensions in some of our schools. And so through the 3-year grant with the Kellogg grants that we had, we did see that work of behavioral health in schools that had higher suspension rates, we saw decreases overall across our program. So we do know how some of the work that we can do to reduce them, and that's some of the work that we need to continue doing and through a more holistic lens to increase practices like restorative practices so that we have general best practices in the school district that we know can help prevent out-of-school suspensions over time.
Thank you, because I think our board we've been talking about that for several years, and I think while we seem to compare well with high school suspensions to other districts, I think there is a lot of work we need to do as a district for those K-8 disruptions, because we can all, across pre-K 12, I think we need to prefer our students being in school, and we see the disproportionalities not just with black students, but special education students are 12% of our population and almost 41% of suspensions. I mean, that's an alarming gap that we need to make sure that we focus on and continue to address, because all of our students need to be in school and engaged in learning, and suspensions interrupt that, most certainly. And I'm glad to underscore the work of the community resilience model. I walked into a regional program today where the teacher was going through what zone every student was in, from blue to green to yellow and red. So it's important for us to try to understand where our students are coming from so we can support them every day, obviously. But I think it's particularly whatever we can do to interrupt the suspension data particularly where we have these disproportionalities, is important. So thank you for bringing this to us and for continuing the work.
Thank you for your questions and comment, Ms. Kushner. That is absolutely important work, the restorative practices and the zones of regulation. I know anecdotally data shows very promising results, especially when students have been through restorative programs, when you take that different approach and when you're given those skills, provided those skills at a younger level, we can assume that does lead to success. So thank you so much.
So kids can communicate where they are, and I think our end goal across the district is keeping kids in class, keeping kids in the school building, as Dr. Martin talks about the ALCs, but really keeping them in their class and not disrupting that important learning for anyone. Thank you.
Yes, and Dr. Martin, I meant to highlight your comment as well about the alternative learning centers. So for people who don't understand, those are in school suspension that are inside of the buildings.
Well, here is a point. They've been treated too much like in-school suspension. An alternative learning center needs to be a learning center, right? It is not an alternative to suspension. Because unfortunately, I think many of our ALCs are ASCs, there we are, alternative suspension centers, instead of alternative learning centers. And the reason I keep harping on, it feels like harping, on let's evaluate them, how effective are they, is I want to know what learning is going on. I mean, to Ms. Kushner's point, we like everybody in the classroom, but there are times where there is disruption that we need to remove from the classroom. And I think that sometimes what is heard as we discuss the suspension issue is teachers, you just deal with it, keep the kids in the classroom, even though they're disruptive, or disciplinary issues, or what have you. The issue is not just deal with it, keep it in the classroom. There are times where you need to remove a child from the classroom from a particular engagement. That doesn't mean you disengage them from school. It means you disengage from that acute event. But we need a true alternative learning center so that we move into a learning space where we're learning both whatever the curricular stuff is, as well as behavioral, social, emotional supports, and whatever. So as long as I'm here, I'm going to keep pushing that we really need alternative learning centers and not alternative suspension centers, which I think we too often have.
I appreciate that clarification.
Completely agree.
Your view of looking at it as public health, we've set up these care centers for COVID.
Yep. And they also shouldn't just be places for the kids to sit.
Right.
They need to be places for health.
Right. And here we can use that as an analogy.
Exactly.
So thank you for that connection, Dr. Martin.
That is, yes, very much appreciate that. And Dr. McFarland, I don't know if at some point we might be able to learn a little bit more about what are best practices for those alternative learning centers, because absolutely there are times the student may need to be removed from that classroom, and that's a reset not just for the classroom but for the student. I mean, sometimes that is what helps everyone along, but best practices around those I think would be extraordinarily helpful for us to understand, and then if it's a lack of resources to make sure that all of those are performing to where they should be, that could help the board provide direction, I think, around those.
You're absolutely right. We've had some of those discussions, and we can bring some of that information. It's just we were starting some of those discussions last March, and so here we are.
Yes, well, we had so many pre-COVID plans and discussions, but we're getting back on it, and absolutely it's important to keep this work going. Ms. Johnson-Hassler.
Ms. Scott, before we jump into Ms. Johnson-Hassler, could I just also add that Dr. Martin and Ms. Scott and everyone bringing up the focus on ALC, we'll definitely bring that back as a point of discussion, but we also wanted to note that that's also the reason we've started implementing the ALC professional learning team, so that these best practices could be discussed, and we've instituted those since this past January, because COVID slowed us down before. But we just want you to know that this is on our radar and our team is working on it, but we'll bring the reports back to make sure we get your insights and continue to improve these programs.
Thank you, Mr. Coe.
Thank you.
Perfect. You prevented me from saying, hey, I thought we already asked this. Because I don't need you to bring back what an ALC is. We brought that back a million times. We asked actually, and thank you, Mr. Coe, for noting what we asked last time, which is to actually tell us what they actually say that they do and believe that they do. And Mr. Coe, I know you've heard me beat the drum a million times when I talk to school counselors. They have very strong feelings that ALC was not being implemented in the way that it should be. And so thank you very much for letting us know you started, and we'll restart. Because while I would like to bring everybody up to speed, I'd rather you do that in an email than keep bringing back what our documents say it is. So I'd certainly rather hear what the PLT is able to provide to us in terms of how it's implemented. And Dr. Martin, you couldn't see my amen back here. I don't know how else to say. I think that it was brilliant that you talked about this in the framework of a public health concern. I mean, for somebody who works in sexual violence, which is hard to explain to people, while anything that is an epidemic is a public health concern, it certainly is. There is no district who doesn't continue to talk about this, and ours is one of those. And so at some point, we have to acknowledge that that's great, we see a reduction, but it's still the same group of kids being suspended, which says to me, we hopefully did something right with some of those kids, although I appreciate noting that it's not apples to apples considering the change in COVID. But I am curious, and I've asked this before, that we take a look at the same group of kids who have repeat suspensions to take a longitudinal look at who they are as students. Because, again, my belief is there are two things that happen. There's behavior, which I think we all go to first, but there's also a ton of biases that happen when a student, again, we've talked about why elementary is important to us. When those kids have several demarcations in their student files, those things follow them. And so do the biases attached to how students are treated. Again, not intentional, but they are implicit biases that says, Monica has been a talker since kindergarten, so Monica is going to talk in my class, so I'm going to be sure that I pay attention to that the day Monica sits down in my classroom, right? All the way down to how we seat children. Again, I think it's important that I say this isn't about what teachers do intentionally. It is about the things that we haven't talked about that continues to perpetuate. Again, it's like over-policing. Well, of course you can note who's got a crime when you run my tag and see that I speed, right? I mean, we know that happens. And so again, for me, I just will continue to beat the drum or the harp, that I believe that until schools take a look at these implicit biases that continue to follow a kid throughout their school career, we almost don't give some of them a chance. And when we look at, again, not just the disproportionality for Black kids, but for our students with disabilities, and again, I will end on two things. One, thank you, Mr. Coe, again, for going back to let us know that, of course, we halted the cohort model, but we will return to it, because I think that those are things that have contributed to the decrease that we've seen. And I want to be clear that I'm not going to rest on my laurels and say, great job, Wake County, we can move on. We can't, because the issue still persists. It's just a smaller number, but still a number that I think that we have a lot of work to uncover to create the change that these students deserve to have educational outcomes, which is our job. So I want us to continue to push the envelope on looking longitudinally at these students, because clearly we know who they are. Just, definitely based on the data, who's repeated. The other piece for me around these multiple suspensions of the same kids is the work that, as I said, and I, again, will give school counselors all the credit for these ideas because they were not mine, but that is also how you use ALC to reintegrate students early on when they're suspended in middle school. We don't really have ALC in elementary, but it's definitely a pathway for not just a reset for the day's behavior, as Dr. Martin eloquently gave as an example of how we could use it, but how do we also use it as a reset when a student has been suspended when they come back into the building? We know that restorative practices looks like it includes a reintegration in terms of relationships, and the same thing I believe, and so do these school counselors have convinced me, that also would be helpful for those students coming back into the building, because there's a ton, whether people believe it or not, there's a ton of shame attached to coming back after you've been suspended. We all know bullying and teasing kids is still very real, and those things are attached, which We also know by reading some of these files that students' misbehavior is a reaction to another person's action, because again, they're children. They haven't regulated all their zones yet, and we still have to suspend them based on the action. So if we are proactive in the reintegration approach that some of the school counselors have mentioned. Again, another drum I know I'm beating, Mr. Coe, you've heard it a million times. But again, I have not talked about it in student achievement as much. I've mostly bothered Mr. Coe with these ideas. So I certainly, want to make what I believe are great examples from our schools who are giving these examples, but don't have a way to implement them based on their role at our schools. So again, not my ideas. I take no credit, but definitely want to reiterate the great ideas that have come from our schools and our school counselors primarily.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler, thank you so much for that. And when you were speaking, it made me recall, as Ms. Cash would say if she were here 1,000 years ago, but 100 years ago when I was in a teacher education training program in my undergraduate, part of the course requirements was an educational psychology course, and you also had your field observation requirements that you had to do before you would get your degree. And one of the things that we did, without telling the teacher that that's why we were there, they had no idea, but we looked to see the number of times a student was redirected, the language that was used when redirecting a child, what was the behavior that was being redirected. And when you look at that, if you watch a recording of yourself, it can be painful for some people to see that. But it's so necessary, because that is exactly how we move forward and move on. And you can't do that without the training. So I appreciate all of your comments. And
one thing I will add that you just made me think of is my family has a ton of educators from early childhood education. And one of the things that we've talked about constantly at this table as well, not this table, but our school board table, is the pipeline that is no longer really in existence for education. A large part of that, if you talk to our educators who are retiring or leaving, other than pay and morale and overall treatment in our state climate. But the other reality is they aren't taught how to provide classroom management. That's not it is a skill that's built in observation, but it is not coursework. And as for somebody who understands and trains adult, the bulk of my job of understanding adult principles is understanding adult behavior in the space so that I can adequately address when I'm training adults. That doesn't happen for teachers. And so we're sending them into classrooms, asking them to do something different than they experienced without teaching them how to do something different. Because we all know, most of us do what we know, which is what we were learned, which was our own experiences. And your education is kind of sort of back there, but the reality is the way that you show up is your experiences. And most educators say that that's exactly how they know how to do classroom management. So that's a larger conversation for us as advocates for educators, is really schools of education are slowly shrinking because there's nobody there. You know, I've had a kid who thought she was going to be a chemistry teacher for a very long time. That's a very different conversation now because it is the shrinkage is happening. And I think as advocates, that's also our responsibilities to be having larger conversations about how we prepare our teachers to come into buildings.
Absolutely. And when we hear language out there to sort of fast track folks to licensure, I mean, that's one of the things that quite honestly frightens me, are this type of training. And you highlighted that it's not even really completely there to where it should be now. I think the MTSS, as much as we support that, in our district and throughout the state, I mean, that's still not really a part of teacher education programs. That language is not used consistently in teacher education programs. So I appreciate all of those comments very, very much. I did want to highlight that Chris Haggerty also did join us virtually, so he's been listening in on the meeting as well. And Vice Chair Mahaffey.
Yes, thank you. As I'm listening to my colleagues ask questions, I was curious, Dr. Walker, Mr. Coe, and Dr. Trice and Ms. Shantos, as we're looking at the suspensions that come in from different schools, whether it's, short-term or recommendation, for from long-term to an alternative learning center, if we see a pattern or a higher percentage of suspensions coming out of a school, does that trigger something in one of your offices that maybe this school needs help or a refresher with MTSS or a reminder, or what does that process look like? Or are we just getting them at the end of the year and filling out a report? I know you guys are looking at many different things, but I'm curious, what does that suspension data then inform how we go back to the schools?
Thanks for that question, Ms. Mahaffey. I could start and maybe Dr. Walker and anyone else can jump in, but that's part of the reason we hired the data analyst, Allie Lewis, who's been an amazing person who helps us aggregate the data as out-of-school suspensions come and provide school-by-school reports. So both our area superintendents and our principals and administrators have access to these reports. So that's one of the ways we are encouraging schools to review. But I think we need to also couple that with more professional learning to actually guide the process more. I think in the ways that we've tried to address behavioral health needs, where we're making sure that professional learning is robust and rich around like the core practices and what are the supplemental intensive, I think we could continue to work and grow on how we could use both out-of-school suspension data, but couple it with all the different pieces of data that give us information about students and make sure that overall that our teaching and learning is at its best at all time, as much as possible for our students, so that suspensions can be prevented. Because I think it's important to note that, suspensions are, it's the data point that we're reviewing right now, but usually there's a pre-story to what happened with the suspension about what's been going on with the student. And I think part of our work really is around how to set up the best environment for our students through, our focus on instructional core, like I've mentioned, but also how we support our staff to continue to grow with the best practices.
Yeah, I can add, Mr. Coe, Ms. Mahaffey, if that's fine. I think that also we're definitely a district that has many resources. And so what I've really worked to do is make sure that the data is not secret for our schools. And so I want schools to know who they're suspending. And I want the principal at school A to be able to see the data from school B. And they have that ability now. I want area superintendents to have quick ability to access the data of this exclusionary practice at their fingertips, and they have that now to be able to engage. I want those that are leading with MTSS, those within counseling and student services, you name it, to be able to know when we are suspending, so it's not just held within our department. And through these various avenues of utilizing strategically the resources to try to really prevent additional suspensions. Because as you see this number, even from last year, right, 4,590, we know who those students are. And that's the great thing of being able to demystify who this is. And so there are various mechanisms through various departments that really work in tangent to help rescue these students.
Thank you for that question and for those answers. And I want to thank my colleagues for just really excellent questions and statements and comments and requests. And I trust that these requests will be heard and we will get this information presented again because it's really important work that several of my colleagues have been dedicated to this work for many years on this board, and I want to make sure we highlight and lift up all of that. So I do appreciate the information. So thank you so much to Mr. Coe, Dr. Walker, Ms. Santos, and Dr. Trice for what you presented, to everything this evening, for all of the information. And then also in our first presentation, again, just wanted to thank Ms. Smith, Mr. Cook, Mr. Pittman, and Ms. Hamilton for all of their information and their work on the presentations that we have. So we are done a little early today, which is a nice little opportunity for a break. So again, thank you for all of this information. And this is, I think, we continue to do this work. This is information that will keep our eyes open. I know the summer learning program, there were many questions, but I know our staff is working really hard to provide those much needed answers to our employees and to our families as well. So for right now, it looks like our next Student Achievement Committee meeting is scheduled for May 24th. Of course, as holidays are approaching, we'll just ask for your flexibility and understanding if any of that needs to change. And we will call this, and thank you, Dr. McFarland and Ms. Merrill, for all of your help this evening as well. And we'll go ahead and call this meeting adjourned at 4:52. Thank you.